All right, so we're rushing into the fray as though resolved to die once again, like those troops of Scipio who, after training themselves on destroying cities, um, reducing Carthage to a desert and declaring peace, as Tacitus puts it, um, then easily took offense at other enemies and could not restrain themselves from bursting into flames and consuming some final banquet and some corn alcoholic drink, and then not caring what followed. So some housekeeping on what we're doing. We have three previous attempts to go back and forth from Strauss's introduction to Spinoza to Dostoevsky's seventh chapter of Devils Are the Possessed, to get some, ostensibly to get some insight into liberalism, what the ground of liberalism is in the modern sense as it hovers around the question of the division of state and people. So one thing, some people have written in some criticism, and I encourage that and appreciate it. But I can't take the criticism that tries to push towards a bullet point presentation of text, which would then give something like, as it were, an account of what's in the text, like a synoptic account of what's in the text. Because, I give as an argument against that the whole output of Heidegger, the Gesamtaufgabe of Heidegger, consists largely of going over, if you're a little bit cynical, you could say, of using the whole tradition as fodder, almost as a lumber yard for attempts to think his thinking into fruition. That's probably overstating it, but so in the first part of these recordings on this sort of Einsteinian photon clock, the photon bouncing back and forth between two mirrors as the basic form of measurement. We used the example of we adduced something out of Gottfried Benn. That's not just accidental. All these considerations, and you can see these considerations also if you read closely the Strauss text that I just mentioned, are to some extent always in my awareness when I'm carrying out these investigations. So, for instance, I had to draw back to some extent from saying, on reflection, I see that there's some things that can't be maintained, that Dostoevsky, who was earlier and in a time we might not understand, could be the clear window to Strauss isn't obvious. Strauss, who came later in some ways, since he's actively doing a philosophy meant for people who are steeped in, after all, it's a lot of text that he's reading and going into, and he'd been doing it for a long time when he wrote this introduction. It would be easier. Actually, they're confoundingly difficult in some points. So, for instance, let me give one little example that makes more clear the kind of difficulties I'm thinking about. Like, for instance, there's I've been using and pointed to the Constant Garnet translation of Chapter 7 of Bezier the Possessed. But I've read in the past, but I haven't, and I'm thinking of going back and looking at it again. The Peaver translation, uh, Richard and Maria Peaver, I think they are. They're very good, and I've read a couple um, of their translations. The uh, Crime and Punishment and Devils. They translate largely more literally, so devils rather than the possessed. But on the other hand, if you think about it, Garnet simply lived closer to the time of Dostoevsky, and therefore, just for that reason, there's some, even though she doesn't translate literally, there's some sense where maybe she does get some things that you don't get in the literal translation. The Peaver translations bring out a lot of, Dostoevsky uses a lot of repetitions. He says it uses the same word over and over again in some sense, which is also a technique of Gogol, Dead Souls, and in his other comic works. There's a lot of comedy in Dostoevsky in a certain sense, of course. Um, the word spite, for instance, that you translated the word spite, it seems to be something that in the English speaking consciousness of Dostoevsky makes a lot of sense. Dostoevsky had, in a certain sense, a kind of he was a little bit socially awkward. He had some way. He makes some sort of spiteful comments towards the social dandy, the writer of Turgenev. He makes a lot of nasty comments at the expense of Turgenev, who nonetheless he regarded in high esteem. But so there's considerations. We're steeped in all kinds of considerations of these kinds, and it's not easy to impose this kind of rule of going from the simple to the more complex, or even this higher rule of the higher, because we don't have here. When Strauss speaks of going from the higher to the lower, reading the lower in the light of the higher, in order to not distort the higher by reading in the light of the lower, he's thinking of things like Maimonides or some high authorities on the what's now called the Orthodox tradition, but which was, so far as I understand it, the reason we have to speak of an Orthodox Judaism is basically because everybody was more or less Orthodox until a certain point where then only some people has a sort of entrenching, almost like a, how do you call that when people are fundamentalists? So the Orthodox and the fundamentalists almost go together in a certain sense. Fundamentalism means somehow you're aware that you're fighting against something. It implies somehow an outside. It implies somehow that you know about other cultures as other cultures, or something along those lines. But in any case, I see now that I've misunderstood part of what Strauss is saying. So one of the most confounding and really almost painful sentences is where he says, Cohen read Spinoza on the one hand not literally enough, and on the other hand much too literally. He understood himself too literally because he did not read him literally enough. He understood him too literally because he did not read him literally enough. And then at the end, he bookends that by, at the very end of the introduction, he bookends this by accusing himself of something similar. He says, I understood Spinoza too literally because I did not understand him literally enough. So this is almost totally unintelligible. What the hell is he talking about? So that sort of misled me at first. But now I see what he's saying is that he cites Deuteronomy 4:6, where he's saying the Jewish people have wisdom and understanding ahead of all the other people, and especially understanding. And he's saying that through a complicated reading, one can show that what Spinoza understands here by reason is more open. Um, he's saying something along the lines of what he says in this metaphor of the fire and the ashes, that if there's a living tradition, the letter of the law, the literal understanding is like the ashes. It's like the dead part. The fire is the living part of it. So if you're in a living tradition, you can't just point to the letter of the tradition. You have to have a sense of what it means to be alive in that tradition. And it's not even a tradition so much as it's just a way of life. That between Rosenzweig and Hermann Cohen, there's a criticism which Strauss then moves in and criticizes on the point of some close textual issues, which I'll bring that in a more clear presentation in the upcoming posts, as it were. I think this is part 4. So there'll be a part 5. So we were talking in the last one about the economic component of modern liberalism, and Strauss does mention here that Spinoza was like his predecessor in a way. Calvin has allowed for usury and the economic emancipation and transformation of the people. He's also made these comments about the effeminate nature of Judaism, which is because it's so strapped to the idea of a certain understanding that the human problem can't be solved through earthly means, will never have a state. So then we can see the connection of Zionism and the state of Israel coming into existence as a point of sort of a bastardization, which runs along with liberalism in this sense. So there's a analogy that can be made here that just I think is useful. On the one side, you have liberalism, which sort of bastardizes itself, and one of the forms of the bastardization is it becomes the communism, it becomes fascism, it becomes, and we can add Zionism, which Dugin doesn't necessarily add, but I don't know if he's contemplated it in this light. But you can say what goes along with this is the basic issues Strauss is going into in his introduction, which is there's a point where religion ceases to be regarded as something terrifying or awesome, through which, and this is in Strauss's earliest works. If you go back to his first, there's a book, it's like 200 pages long, I think, I forget what it's called, but if you go back to them, where he's talking about sort of the inversion of the understanding of religion, which circles around, we no longer think of earthquakes or lightning as messages from God, or the thing about the comet, John Bowden, and all this stuff, or the earthquake at Lisbon. But that in early times, Epicureanism was a sort of a cure for this terror or existential dread. But there came a point where religion was interpreted not as having to do with this terror, and then with the prophets saying, well, maybe there's some dim hope in here, something like that, to the idea of the opium of the that religion is something that just sort of soothes the situation. That point corresponds then where Strauss, this the subject matter of Romanticism is very complex, as you'll see if you read Isaiah Berlin's excellent accounts of this, very voluminous and complex. But Strauss goes right to the nub of it and says, here you have a movement that longs again for the old sense of religion. And so this sense is easily linked up to fascism and to people like, you can see that in the literature around Knut Hamsun, for instance, is the best, that's the highest representative of that literature, I think. Because he's not even romantic in the sense of Caspar David Friedrich or something like that. I don't mean this example as, this example is just a slight little peephole into it, but one of Hitler's favorite artists, if not his favorite artist, was Caspar David Friedrich, right? So that's a sign of the link between the Romanticism and fascism. In Knut Hamsun, you get something which is sort of more mature and much stronger than any Romanticism, I think, and it's closer to what Heidegger is later accused of in his being this back to the land type of movement thing. So that's a key moment, I think, with regard to understanding the deeper meaning of liberalism, is this moment which is associated, which we can then show which side of it Hegel is on. Hegel is probably on the side that's post-Kantian, right? So then we can see more clearly what the dissension or what the break between Dugin and Zizek is. So Zizek is still in this modern religion as opium, but still going towards the communist break or towards something like that, or towards the Hegelian movement. Whereas Dugin is more on the side of the old-time religion, let's say, somewhat lightly speaking. So we have to clarify that and hone in on it and make give us more candor so that we can really see what we're talking about there. And we shouldn't be worried about going over the same territory again and again, because like I said, if that's wrong, that's what Heidegger did. His whole output is like that. And I think I'm seeing some connections here with the way Heidegger's usage and Zizek's usage, where Zizek speaks of interpolation and things like that. Interpolation, the Alsace-Syrian concept, runs very close to Das Mann in Heidegger, and then on the other side, the authenticity, or the some form of Eigenlich as appropriation. It runs very close to Zizek's hysterics discourse, and also to this question of the essence of Dasein as being in the future. But all this needs to be, obviously, is very, I'm saying very loosely, and we should also